Here's a question. Which is worse, no healing of leprosy or no forgiveness? Well, when I think of it, I would rather have forgiveness, because forgiveness is a thing of the soul. And if you feel that you're not forgiven, then it has a way of gnawing at you. It has a way of destroying you from the inside. Well, actually, what we've got here then is we've got 5 different conflicts which Jesus had with people that I'm going to list for you in just a moment. But I think that the main topic that we have here is that the whole idea that he was able to forgive sins. This was quite a claim that Jesus made. In fact, it reminds you of the little poem. It's the hardest thing to give away and the last thing on your mind today. It always goes to those who don't deserve. It's the opposite of how you feel. When the pain they caused is just too real, it takes everything you have to say, the word forgiveness. It flies in the face of all your pride. It moves away the mad inside. It's always anger's own worst enemy, even when the jury and the judge say you've got a right to hold a grudge. It's the whisper in your ear saying, set it free, forgiveness. Well, we all love forgiveness. And I think that if people had really understood who Jesus was, wherever he went to preach, and this all occurred during his Galilean ministry, and when he was preaching, naturally, people had to learn his identity. And so when they learned who he was and saw that he was really, truly the Son of God, as this is going to reflect this in this story before it's over today. But I want you to notice, for someone to understand that here was one who could forgive sins. This must have been really an astonishing thing. I know it was an astonishing claim that Jesus made. If you'll notice in chapter 2 of Mark, and beginning in verse 1, and going all the way through chapter 3 and verse 6, we have actually a lot of conflict in these verses, in these chapters. Actually, this conflict breaks down into 5 separate points, and I'll mention those to you as we go along. Actually, they were not with the people. You would think that maybe perhaps the people would have said, he's not able to forgive sins, and perhaps a crowd would develop into a mob, and then the mob would pursue him and try to do him wrong and do him damage. But that wasn't the case at all. It was the religious leaders who said, this one is not able to do what he claims to do. So Mark then records 5 instances in which the Israel's leaders opposed Jesus. Evidently, they're not given, Mark does not give them in a chronological order. These occurred during his Galilean ministry. And of course, Mark appears to have grouped them so that his readers would see the opposition that came from the leaders of the religious order of the time. Particularly those that it was something that Jesus had to contend with and he had to overcome. Because naturally, no matter what the attitude was, in reference to the conflict with the religious leaders threw at him, he was being watched. The ordinary man was being watched. And I get the impression as I read the Gospels, particularly when it comes to conflict with the religious leaders, although Jesus loved all men, yet Jesus had not settled on simply coming to redeem the religious leaders. If any of them had given their lives to Christ, such as Nicodemus or Bartimaeus or any of them like that, that would have been fine. But Jesus was more interested in the sinners, and those were the ones that were looked upon as being unlawful and of terrible behavior. And as a consequence then that there were those that who formed the opposition against Jesus, and that was one of the main points that they brought up, that he eats with publicans and sinners. And consequently, this is showing some approval towards them. And so his readers were probably facing similar opposition. And this section should encourage and help all Christians experiencing conflict, because they are trying to fulfill God's mission for them. What we need to bear in mind is, of course, that this particular book was written to the Romans. It was written some years after Jesus' ministry had taken place. And consequently, the Romans would have gotten this epistle, this letter, and they would have read it. And as a consequence, then, there would be people wanting to know how Jesus dealt with the conflict that was very evident in his ministry. Now, esteem with the masses led to problems with the magistrates, because the people, it would appear, had a great respect for Jesus. They followed Jesus. We'll even see in some of the incidents we'll study together the next few Lord's days that actually they pursued him wherever he went. And even when he was with people in a house, still they pursued the house. They found the address. They got there. They had a friend who needed healed. And they even pursued him to the extent that they let him down through the roof. Well, esteem with the masses led to problems with the magistrates. Naturally, there would be some opposition there. There would be some jealousy there. And so the opposition to Jesus intensifies throughout this particular section. The 5 conflicts that we've already mentioned between Jesus and the authorities in Galilee show a central point to their relationship. And so Jesus was teaching, you remember, in chapter 2, 18 through 22, he's there in a discussion about fasting. And so conflicts or actions, and Jesus' response illuminates all 5 of the conflicts and the responses to him. When all of this is brought together, you can see that they are ready to put him to death. Now, Mark's story is one of conflict. And so conflict is that fierce force that propels the story forward. It intensifies everything in the story. And naturally, you begin to look at those leading characters or personalities that have begun to emerge in the conflict. And we'll see this as we go along. And so since the crowd does not turn against Jesus until his arrest, his antagonists are the authorities. And so the authorities, and I told you who some of them would be. I went through this chapter picking out these people. You have the groups comprising all religious authorities. And that is the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Herodians, the chief priests, the scribes, and then also there were those who were called the elders. So notice in verse 1 and 2, we'll read there, it says, "And again he entered Capernaum after some days, and it was heard that he was in the house. And so immediately many gathered together, so that there was no longer room to receive them, not even near the door, and he preached the word to them." So notice that these 2 verses are an introduction then to what follows. Mark frequently used summaries in what he was saying, and I have a list of summaries here that we won't take time to get into, but they are characteristic of Mark's literary style. Several days afterwards, he says, translates a Jewish phrase like it means after a considerable interval or what have you. Mark is one that injects these little things from time to time that are so characteristic of him. And when Jesus returned to Capernaum after one of his preaching tours, it did not take news of his arrival long to circulate. And so soon the locals were mobbing him. Jesus could not find a restful retreat, even at his home in Capernaum. And he graciously used the opportunity to preach unto them. And of course, Mark's account stresses his tremendous popularity. Now, the rabbis stood confessedly powerless in face of the living death of leprosy. And I can well understand that. I don't know if you have ever seen a leper. I have seen a leper. And I not only have seen a leper, I have touched a leper. I remember baptizing 28 lepers down a well in India. And if the Lord had told me at the beginning of the day, this is what you're going to do before the day was over with, I would have said, whoa, leprosy is not something that you get real close to. But when you see the faces of those people and you see them yearn to know the gospel, and then you find out how far some of them have traveled, it makes you realize that it's a terrible experience that they have had, an instance in their life in which they have contracted leprosy. And yet, lepers need the gospel too. So notice the forgiveness of sins in the case of the paralytic, and then the welcome to the chief of sinners in the call of Levi and Matthew. But this was the innermost meaning of the two events which the gospel places next to the healing of the leper that Jesus met up with. So in verse 3 and 4, we're told, then they came to him, bringing a paralytic who was carried by 4 men. And it says, and when they could not come near him because of the crowd, they uncovered the roof where he was. So when they had broken through, they let down the bed on which the paralytic was lying. And so it's necessary to visualize the layout of a Palestinian house, generally speaking. It was usually a small one-room structure with a flat roof. And then it had the access to the roof was by means of some stairs, external stairs, on the end of the house. And the roof itself was actually made of wooden beams that with thatch, compacted then with earth in order to shed the rain. And so sometimes tiles were placed between the beams and the thatch, and then there was earth placed on top of that soil. And it's somewhat like Irish cottages, if you can have those in your mind. They're built somewhat the same. Another possibility is that there was a roof of a porch that was attached to the house. So Mark's unusually detailed account pictures 4 men, and almost hysterical to get their paralyzed friend to Jesus so Jesus could heal him. And they must have been undaunted about the harm that they were doing to the house. And not only that, I find that this house is crowded. I find it hard to see them removing part of the roof without that dried soil that they had packed up there falling down on the people that were in the house. So they must have been undaunted about the harm that they were doing to the house and the shower of soil that they sent raining down on everyone that was sitting below. Now look at verse 5. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven you." So notice that Jesus responded by dealing with their friend's need than they had expected. Sin is the root of all the sickness. Not that there is always a close correspondence between sinfulness and sickness. You remember John chapter 9, where there the disciples were saying, who sinned, this man or his parents? That's the man who wanted into the water in order to be healed. Well, Jesus said neither, that God might be glorified in all of this. But I want you to turn to Luke chapter 13. And we're going to read in verses 1 through 3, where we have another incident of this in the life of Christ. There were present at that season some who told about the Galatians, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And Jesus answered and said to them, do you suppose that these Galileans were worse sinners than all other Galileans, because they suffered such things? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. So the common thought among the Jew was, a man who had leprosy must have sinned. That's why he got it. Or whatever his physical ailment was, sin had to be in his life that brought that along to that man. So notice then with me that we have here in John 9, I mentioned a moment ago, in verses 2 and 3. And Jesus authoritatively forgave the man's sins as only God could do, and so dealt with the ultimate cause of sickness. We might think that Jesus was only announcing God's forgiveness in view of their faith, as Nathan announced God's forgiveness in reference to David in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 12. Well, we admire several characteristics about these men and the qualities that would have to be there in order to be fishers of men. Actually, these are qualities that we would like to have in all of our friends. There's no doubt about it. As you read this, of these four men, you get the impression that they dearly loved this man, the paralytic, their friend. They wanted him healed. They wanted him whole. And so they were deeply concerned about their friend, and they wanted to see him helped. And they had the faith to believe that Jesus could and would meet his need. No doubt that's why he, complimented the faith that they had. They did not simply pray about it, but they put some feet to their prayers, and they did not permit the difficult circumstances to discourage them. Whatever the obstacle, they thought and found a way around it. They worked together and dared to do something different, and Jesus rewarded their efforts. How easy it would have been for them to say, well, there's no sense trying to get to Jesus today. Look at the size of that crowd. Not only that, not everybody's able to get in the house. So they're crowded in there. Maybe we can come back tomorrow. No, they didn't rationalize that way. They got up on the roof. These are the kind of friends I want. They got up on the roof and they said, okay, if we make a hole here, we can get this man down into the presence of Jesus. So in verse 6 and 7, it says this, and some of the scribes were sitting there and reasoning in their hearts. Now that is a key passage in this whole section right here. Because the rulers of the Jews, the religionists, they were seated in that house, in the middle of this crowd. So this shows that the people had a lot of respect, showed a lot of respect for these religious leaders. But notice that they were sitting there, and Mark points out they were reasoning in their hearts. So the idea here right away comes to my mind that it was an ethical thing that they were reasoning through. The reasoning of the four friends in the opening of the hole to get their paralytic friend down in the presence of Jesus, that's reasoning from a different point of view. These men are reasoning in their hearts. And they're thinking this whole scene that they're seeing, and then hearing Jesus make the statement that he makes. And so why does this man speak blasphemies? What is the blasphemy here? The blasphemy is that he tells them that he can forgive sins. And so who can forgive sins but God alone? So Jesus' assertion to possess divine authority upset this clergy of the law who were present. The fact that they were sitting in that crowded house shows the respect that the Jews had for them. No Old Testament prophet ever claimed personal authority to forgive sins. No one. Though Naaman had announced God's forgiveness of David, but Nathan does not, in a way, he does not claim that he is the one who forgives sins. In fact, in 2 Samuel 12:13, it says, "Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan replied, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die." So this was a different matter altogether from Jesus forgiving sins. Nathan is simply repeating what he had been told from the Lord as a prophet. So the Jews believed even the Messiah could not forgive sins because the Old Testament never attributes that power to him. Only God was able to do that. In fact, the book of Psalms and looking at Samuel 9 and the book of Micah, chapter 7, all of these are references to God's forgiveness. But in this occasion we have his Son. And naturally, this is a claim on the part of Jesus as to his deity. So in verses 8 and 9, "But immediately Jesus perceived in his heart that they reasoned thus within themselves. He said to them, Why do you reason about these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, Your sins are forgiven you, or to say, Arise, take up your bed and walk. But that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins. He said to the paralytic," verse 11, "I say to you, arise, take up your bed, and go to your house." So notice that these actions are equally impossible to men. To forgive sins, or to say, take up your bed and walk, to heal a paralytic. So what is easier to do? Jesus was brilliant. He beat them at logic before he ever got to the scriptures. He had them done in, he had them scratching their head how to deal with his logic. And so these actions are equally impossible for man. And so a person cannot verify his claim to forgive sins, but he can verify his claims if he heals a paralytic. Because the paralytic will get up and walk. But to say to someone your sins are forgiven you is sort of, you can't see that. You can't touch that. You can't smell it. You can't see it. You can't practice the five senses on that. And so the scribes, therefore, assumed that the claim to heal a paralytic was the greater one. And so Jesus frequently used the rabbinic device of asking counter questions, especially when dealing with opponents. Look at chapter 3 of Mark. I want first to read chapter 3 and verse 4 together here. And chapter 3 and 4 says, "And he said to them, Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" but they kept silent. Because he often answered by asking a question. The evident answer to that question was what he was saying was true. It was not only true, but it showed that he had the ability to do what he claimed. And then if you look at chapter 11 of Mark, we have another instance there of the same. In chapter 11 and in about the 30th verse, and here it says, the baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men? He said, answer me. Well, and they reasoned among themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why didn't you not believe him? But if we say from men, they feared the people, for all counted John to have been a prophet indeed. There's not one word of argument listed in the four Gospels against anything that John the Baptist said. There's not even the rationalization that John may not be a prophet. That never. They all accepted the prophetic work that God had sent John the Baptist to do. So Jesus frequently then used the rabbinic device of asking counter questions over and over again. Look at chapter 2 and read with me there, and then again in verse 10. But you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic. And so he did the miracle which they could see, that they might know that he had done the other one that they could not see. So if he could make a paralytic man, a man that's paralyzed, if he could make him rise off of his bed and walk, they were able to see that. Now, who is able to do that? Not a one of them. So there's a very strong possibility that if he forgave a man of his sin, that in actual fact, that's what he had done, because they had just witnessed this impossible thing. And so scholars have debated the meaning of the Mark having called him here the Son of Man. And of course, Mark uses it about 14 times in his book. And then not only that, but he is referring back, no doubt, to the book of Daniel, chapter 7, and verse 13 and 14. And so while the term was recognized to have messianic connections, the title Son of Man would not force the people to make a premature decision concerning his identity in terms of their usual messianic expectations. It would enable him to connect the messianic self-presentation with views more in harmony with his own person, with his own teaching. And so the purpose of Mark's commentary then is to make the community of believers aware that they have experienced the messianic forgiveness of the Son of Man. So in this one little incident here, what do we have? This is one of the first conflicts of 5 that we have at the beginning of the book of Mark. Why are they at the beginning of the book of Mark? In actual fact, if you look at the other Gospels, you'll find that Mark does not, if they record these, Mark does not record the chronological order in which they occurred. So it seems to me that where he placed them is to bring out the opposition that he had, how he dealt with that opposition, and when they implied that he was not the Son of God, how in actual fact he showed that he was the Son of God, and then brings out in this first conflict here The fact that he could forgive sins every bit as much as raising this paralytic. So how would that have appealed to the Roman mind? Well, the evidence was there. No doubt about it. The authorities questioning him, that was there. No doubt about it. And yet, Jesus emerges on the other side as being the Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of Man, linking him with man, how God created him to come and be a servant of man, and yet among men to give his life for the forgiveness of sins. So that's our lesson for today. I hope that you will think about this. It's not a difficult lesson, but it is a lesson in which, it shows how Jesus dealt with conflict. And maybe it's a very, very good illustration of how we should deal with conflict when we talk with people who are not ready to accept Jesus as being the Son of God. Have a nice day, and thank you so much for listening.